Okay, class, in this week, you're going to be introduced to Google Sheets. Google Sheets is basically the Google version of Microsoft Excel. So if we look right here, we are currently in that folder that I had you create for that class. Remember last week you created this folder and shared it with me, this Agri 1010 N1. So while I'm in this folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new Google Sheets. So I clicked on that new icon. I come right here to Google Sheets and click Google Sheets. Now the first thing that I'm going to do, as always, is I'm going to name this sheet. So I'm going to name it the back 40. Now I like Google Sheets for several different reasons. One of the main reasons I like Google Sheets over Microsoft Excel, well, for number one, is you can actually work on it with several different people. You can share it just like that Google Docs that you did last week. You can share it with several different people, and several different people can all be working on the same document at the same time. Another aspect that I really like about it is it links seamlessly with Google Forms. And as we go through the semester, towards the end of the semester, we are going to be dealing with these Google Forms. Another aspect I like about it over Microsoft Excel is that it has certain formulas that Excel doesn't have. Now, Excel is more of a business platform used to handle large amounts of data, and if you were running hundreds of thousands of data points, Excel might be the way to go. But for simple ledgers and things like that, I personally like Google Sheets. So in this video today, we're going to show you the most basic way of using a Google Sheets file, and that is simply to use it as a ledger. And before I really get started, I want to distinguish between columns and rows. So if we see right here, the columns go from top to bottom. So this would actually be column C and column F. And I know that these are different columns, and the columns all have their own name. So this right here would be column A, column C, column E. And as you can see, each of the individual columns is labeled by a letter. It has an alphabetical letter versus the rows. So the rows go horizontally. So they go across. And we can see that each of these rows also has a name too. So this would be row 1, row 6, row 12, and so on and so forth. Each individual row has its own name. And these are named by numbers. So if I were to click on any random cell, each and every single cell has its own name, and it's a combination of the column and row. So for example, this cell is actually C5. This cell would be B2 because it's in column B, row 2. So if I ever tell you, well, go to cell D17. Well, D17 is right here because we're in column D, row 17. And just to kind of help you stay a little bit more organized and stay on track whenever you're doing these assignments and make sure that you're in the right cell, if you were way over here out kind of in left field and clicked on a random cell, we can always figure out which cell that is because the column, so this particular column letter is actually highlighted a different color. It's more of a darker gray. So we know that we are in column M because it's highlighted that darker gray. And we're in row 27 because it's highlighted a darker gray. So you don't always have to know exactly which cell we're in just by clicking on it because it highlights which column and which row that cell is in. And if I click around, we can see that those columns and row numbers are actually changing as we click around. Now with Google Sheets, you can do a lot of different things. You can use it as just a simple ledger. We can begin to input a lot of different formulas and make it more of a robust calculator. And if you get good enough with it, you can actually begin to do some automation to where it automatically updates, it automatically does some things. We in this class are going to first, and today we're going to talk about how to use it as a ledger, just as a data entry system. And then as we get later on in the class, we're going to bring in formulas. We're going to talk a little bit about automation, but not very much. Not in this class, at least. So whenever we're doing or using it as a data entry point, using it as a ledger, we have one of two options. We can either put our categories In columns, so let's say we have 10 different categories. So category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's just stop at 6. Or we can put our categories in rows. So what does that really mean? Well, if we put our categories in columns, where the very first cell is the title of that column, so this would be called the categories column. This would be the number 1 column, or the number 1 category, the number 2 category, and so on and so forth. What we do is, if we put our categories in columns, then we put all of our individual data points in rows. The other aspect about it is we could put categories, and please excuse my spelling, categories in rows. So this very first cell of each row then becomes the category labels. And you can do it one of two ways. Now, there are pros and cons to each. If you do the categories in columns, like what you're going to need to do for this assignment, then each individual data point has its own row. So for this assignment, you're going to be putting the different categories in each column, and then the data points, each data point pertains to a different animal. So animal number 1 is here, animal number 2 is here, and animal number 3 is here. Now, if you were to put categories in these rows, then what it would be each individual column dealt with a different animal. And I'm going to show you how to do it first in the columns, and then I'll show you an example of what it would look like in rows. But just bear in mind that whenever we're dealing with a smaller amount of columns, or a smaller amount of categories, but a larger amount of data points, to me it makes more sense to put these columns, or to put the categories in columns. When there are a few amount of categories, lots of data points, it makes sense to me to put the categories in the columns. Now, if there were a lot of categories, a lot of different categories, but very few data points, I would say let's put the categories in rows. But you'll see what that looks like all here in a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and just enter in all of the data that you're going to need to put in for this particular assignment. So actually I fibbed to you a little bit. I'm not going to put in all of the data just yet, but I am going to start off by putting my category names. So each one of these are the category names that you're going to need to put in. So you can see I've got about 7, 8 different categories that I'm going to use. So remember, I said small amount of categories, large number of data points. I'm going to be putting it in columns, my categories in columns. So we're going to start off with the tag number, description, calving date, pregnancy results, the birth year, or the previous year's calving date. Now, as you can see, both of these are kind of cut off, aren't they? Well, if I click on this particular cell, it does show me what the full name of that category is. Birth year, traits, and comments. But if you were to print off this spreadsheet and carry it with you, it doesn't look very good to have where it says previous years and then you don't see the rest. Or this says preg, res, and then it doesn't say the rest. So there's a simple solution to actually expanding these columns. So I want this column to be able to see everything within the column, whatever it reads. So I'm actually going to come up here, take my mouse in between these two cells. Sorry, it's running slow on me. And if I put my mouse in between those two columns, way up here at the top, in between D and E, and if I hold my mouse in the middle, it kind of creates this little arrow on both sides. Me personally, I like to think of it as a little dumbbell. And if you double click, once you see that dumbbell, double click with the left, with your left button, you see how it automatically expands that particular column to allow all the words in there. And I could come right here and I could double click right here. See again, I put my mouse in between, it creates a dumbbell, double click, and it automatically expands it to what it's supposed to say. Now it doesn't just do that for the very first cell. So here I have just something that's typed in down here on row 5, column I, row 5, and cell I5. And I'm going to put my mouse in between, double click, and it's going to expand it. So by double clicking on the right hand side of that column up here between the column labels, by double clicking right there, it automatically expands that particular column to the proper width to allow everything to be visible. Now this is a very handy little trick as you go through this class, and it's one of those nice little tricks that you know about to where you can always expand a cell to match what you need it to match. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to actually underline all of these column categories, all of these different categories that we're going to be placing in columns. And I want to do that, not underline it with the cell outlines. I actually want to underline it using the, or just have each individual word underlined. So there's a couple of different ways that we can do that. So I just kind of want to give it some distinction here. So I'm going to go click right here on Format and click right here on Underline. Now all of my labels have this underline aspect to them, which is very good. That's what I want. But there's another way that you can do it, and it's by the use of what's called hotkeys. So I'm using a PC. So with that, in our Windows 10, I'm using Windows 10, and I'm going to use the hotkey, and I'm going to press Control, the CTRL button, and U at the same time. And if I press Control U, it underlines or takes the underline off. And if I press Control U again, it underlines it. If you're dealing with the laptop, you might need to press Control FNU or Control Alt U. There might be different variations. If you're dealing with an Apple, typically instead of pressing Control, you press Command U. But that's one of those little hotkeys. And if I wanted to, I could actually make these labels bold, or unbold them, or italicize them. Just something to kind of make them a little bit more of a distinction to let me know that these are the category columns, or these are the category types. Pause the video, went ahead and just plugged in some data that I'm going to use on each one of these animals. So I'm going to need to come up with 50 animals here. And if I highlight all of these different animals, and let's see if I can move this, and I've highlighted all those different animals, and I'm going to come down here. And down here it shows us kind of a quick little data synopsis of what is going on. So if we added up all those numbers, it would add up to 6,869, but that's not really what we need to know. So I'm going to move this again. But if I click on, sorry, let me highlight all those again. So if I highlight all these numbers, and I click on this down here, it's going to show me the sum, the average, what's the minimum, what's the maximum, and then count. So it's going to count how many numbers, or count the number of cells that are highlighted, as well as count the number of numbers in that. And I see that I've got a count of 50, which means I've got 50 animals there that I'm dealing with. And then I went ahead and put in descriptions, but here's the problem with some of my descriptions. Some of them are cut off. So I'm going to come right up here, find that little dumbbell, and double click. Now I get to where I've entered in all the calving dates. And I see there's a little bit of an issue with my calving dates. That it's a number, not a date. And you might run into this. Now you could plug in, say, 4-16-19. And it plugs in the date just like that, which is great. But every single date has an underlying number to it. And you might type in a date and it throws it off as a number. Well, I'm going to kind of show you how you can adjust that. So we have that cell highlighted. We're in cell E3 right now. Have it highlighted. I'm going to click right here on More Formats. And I can go right now, if I click on Automatic, you see it automatically adjusts it to a number. And I could go Plain Text or all these different scenarios. But I want it to be a date. So I can come down here to say Date. So let's go ahead and take all of these different numbers. All of these numbers are dates. There's an underlying date associated with it. So if I click here and I go down to date, it's going to plug in all of my dates for all these calving aspects. Now, if we just stop and think about a rancher during a calving season, he typically knows when that calving season is. He or she may not need the 2019 or the 2018. Actually, it kind of clutters things up a little bit, at least to me, whenever we're seeing 2-14-2019. Shouldn't we really, if we already know what the calving season is, shouldn't we really only need the month and the day that animal was born? So I'm going to highlight. So I just simply clicked on the very first cell, drug down, and highlighted all of these different numbers. And I'm going to come right here, and instead of just clicking on date, I'm going to go right here to more formats and say more date and time formats. So then it brings up this nice little box to where I can kind of add or delete things. So I'm just going to simply click right here and say delete. And then I'm also going to delete this backslash and say apply. Now we have just the month and the day. Now I could come in here and I could adjust it how I wanted to adjust it. Go right here to these where it says 1, 2, 3, more formats, more date and time. And I could say instead of this slash, I want to be a dash. And now we have all of the dates in the dash. So that's where you're going to go to adjust these numbers, is you go to these more formats, more date and time formats. But since we're talking about that, I want to talk a little bit about how these numbers correspond to different dates and times. So let's try 4,000 here and 5,000 here. So we have 1, 2, 3 here, and then all of these are in the thousands. So if I highlight all these and I say I want this to be date, we see that the very first date associated with like the number 1 is 12/13 of 1899. The number 2 is 1 day later on the 1st of January 1st, 1900. The number 2, remember that was the number 2 previously, that was the second day, or sorry, the number 3, because remember this was number 1, number 2, and number 3. The number 3 was 1 day after it. So as we go through these dates, all they are is each number, each corresponding number, each next number corresponds with the very next date. This was, I believe, 1,000. The number 1,000 was corresponding to this date. 2,000 was basically 3 years later. 4,000 showed this. 5,000 was that. And 6,000 was here, if I'm not mistaken. So what if we figure out today's date? I'm recording this on 8-19-19. So if I click right here and I want to figure out, well, what is today's date? I'm going to click right here and say number. So today's date is 43,696.00. Well, I'm going to take that information and I say, what if it's 43,696.5? Remember that this whole number is corresponding with today's date. Well, what if I click on date? Still shows today's date. Remember, today's the 19th when I'm recording this. What if I said date and time? So by me plugging in that decimal place, it actually is pertaining to a different time period. So this is right at noon during the day. And if I double click, or if I put this back into number format, I say that this is actually equal to no longer 0.5, it's equal to 0.25. And I put it back into date and time. Now we see it's dealing with 6 o'clock in the morning. So what I'm trying to get at is each date has a corresponding number with it. And if you ever get a number when you're trying to type in a date, you just simply need to adjust it up here using this little icon right there. Okay, folks, now that we've got the date situation all put together, I went ahead and just added this extra information as far as what else you're going to need to add. The only things I left blank are these traits and comments, simply because I don't want to have to go in there, but you will have to. Yes, this is the one time I'm saying you have to do something that I'm not going to. But in any case, you can see I just got everything added in there. Whenever you go through this assignment, there's a couple other key things I want you to realize. First off, you need to make sure that all of the words in each cell are visible. So remember, we said you need to expand those columns based off like we did up here. The other thing you need to do is you need to make sure that there are 50 animals total, and we did that by going down there using that quick synopsis deal. Your dates, they need to be in month and day format. I do not want the year included on them. And then we also need to include pregnant or open. Here's a nice little key trick. You may think this is silly, but an open cow does not have a calf. So if we see right here, that cell is blank because that cow was open. An open cow will not have a calf. So if I typed in, say, 3-17 right here, and that says open right next to it, I think you're full of nonsense and you didn't mark that right. So make sure that the open cows don't have a date. Another thing about it is make sure whenever you're looking at these dates that the calving date from this year and the calving date from the previous year aren't drastically different. So what I mean by that is if you have a calf born in April of this year, but that calf was actually born in, say, January of 18, that might be feasible. That means that cow or that calf came back, or that cow came in late. It was actually 3 months late. So, but if this says something like she gave birth in, well, actually I have that backwards. If she gave birth in April here, but then she gave birth in December here, well, that doesn't quite give her enough time to heal back up, because she gave birth here. She would have to be in gestation for 9 months. And if you do the math, including the extra month or two for her to re-heal or to come back and start cycling again, there's not quite enough time between April of one year and December of the next. So make sure that as you're going through these, you keep those dates at least reasonable. Just kind of make sure that all of these dates, everything on here is reasonable. And as you can see, there are a couple of blank ones in my example, and that is from those cows being open. So just kind of make sure you keep all that in line. Also, we need the birth years, and don't just go on there and say, oh, everything was born in 2015. Yeah, that's not really going to work. And if you also come in here and say that they were born in 2019, but yet they had, I was actually on the wrong row. If they were born in 2019, but they had a calf in 2019, I'm going to say you're full of nonsense there as well. So as you go through this, make sure you have your information in columns, and also to keep this realistic. Now next I'm going to show you what this would look like. So here we have everything, all of the categories that are in the columns. But I'm going to pause this real quick, and then when we come back, I'm going to show you what it would look like if all of the data was in, or the categories were in rows. Okay, so here we have an example, is if we put all of the categories in columns, or we put all of these in, all the categories in rows, not columns. And sorry, my computer is running slow, so bear with me real quick. So here we have all of the underlined categories. And we're going to adjust this to where you can see everything. So if we look, and here are all of our different categories, and here is the first animal. Here's the second animal. So whereas before, if we put our categories in columns, each individual line is an animal. If we put our categories in rows, each individual column is an animal. And this is why I would make the strong argument that if you have a lot of or just a few categories, but a lot of data points, So each animal is a data point. If you have a lot of categories, or a few categories, but a lot of data points, put that in columns because it makes it a lot cleaner. If you have a few data points, but a lot of categories, then put it in each category as its own row. And I know I've taken up about 25 minutes of your time, and that should cover the main parts of what you need to know, or cover everything you need to know for this week's assignment.